My name is Gerald Anson. I am 82 years old, a retired mechanical engineer, and I live alone in the outskirts of Tucson, Arizona. My house is small, single-story, the kind of place you might picture when someone says modest but well-kept, with a trimmed lawn and faded wind chimes clinking softly on the back porch. My wife, Marlene, passed away 6 months ago. People say that kind of thing gets easier with time, but they're either younger than grief or older than caring. For me, it hasn't gotten easier. It's gotten quieter, lonelier, sharper in the edges. The silence in the mornings is no longer just silence. It's absence, like the air is missing something essential. When I wake up, I don't reach for her anymore. That stopped about a month after the funeral. I just stare at the ceiling, letting the fan creak through its tired revolutions, knowing that the day will be long and undisturbed. Marlene and I were married for 54 years. We had our share of fights, disappointments, and rough patches, as every couple does. But she was the soul of my life, the steady warmth in every room, the person I could sit with for hours without speaking and never feel a moment of boredom. She laughed with her whole face, sang when she cooked, and knew how to make even bad news sound like a shared joke. In the final year of her life, her body began to betray her. Arthritis flared, her blood pressure became erratic, and eventually she was diagnosed with congestive heart failure. She had good days and terrible ones. I tried my best to care for her, but I was tired too, my joints stiff, my breath shorter than it used to be. And sometimes, in my darker moments, I was impatient. I said things I regretted. Or worse, I said nothing at all when she needed comfort. That silence still haunts me more than any raised voice ever could. Our only child, Peter, lives 20 minutes away. He's 54, a software analyst, married to Dana, with 2 grown kids of his own. For a time, he visited often. When Marlene was still alive, he would come by every Saturday, bring groceries, help me fix things around the house, and stay for dinner. Marlene adored him, even when he was difficult. She always said he was sensitive underneath his sarcasm and distance. I used to believe that too, but something shifted after Marlene's condition worsened. Peter stopped coming by. He said he was busy, overloaded at work, that Dana's mother had been unwell too. There were always reasons. Marlene tried to excuse him, but I saw the hurt in her eyes when he missed birthdays, when he didn't call on anniversaries, when she sat in her chair waiting for the doorbell that never rang. I remember one afternoon last spring, just weeks before she passed, she asked me quietly if I thought Peter loved her. The question cut through me like a blade. I told her the truth, that I believed he did, in his own way, but that perhaps he didn't know how to show it anymore. She nodded, her eyes wet, and said, "Maybe I should have written him more. Maybe I should have told him how I felt." What I didn't tell her that day was that she had written something. One evening, after she'd gone to bed early, I noticed a stack of papers on her desk. I hadn't intended to pry, but the top page had my name on it, and underneath it, Peter's. I read just a few lines, enough to understand it was a letter. A long one. The kind of letter people write when they know they won't get another chance. I didn't read more. I felt like an intruder, even in my own house, even when it was my wife's handwriting. I put the pages back and never mentioned it again. After her death, I forgot about the letter completely. The following months were a blur of hospital forms, death certificates, condolence cards, casseroles dropped off by neighbors who meant well but lingered too long. I slept poorly, ate little, and felt every one of my 82 years pressing into my chest. Peter arranged a memorial service. It was tasteful, quiet, respectful. He spoke briefly, formally, almost like he was reading a script he didn't write. Dana offered a few kind words. Their children, my grandchildren, didn't say anything. I understand that. Grief is heavy for the young. Still, I expected more. Not a grand tribute, but something real, something heartfelt. Afterward, at the reception held at Peter and Dana's home, I wandered through the rooms like a guest, not a father or a grandfather, shaking hands, smiling at strangers. No one mentioned Marlene beyond the usual, "She was a lovely woman." I wanted to scream. She wasn't just lovely. She was fierce, hilarious, complex. She deserved more than a past tense adjective. But I stayed quiet, as I have learned to do. That evening, when I got home, I sat in the kitchen with a glass of water, watching the dark swallow the backyard. That's when I remembered the letter. I found it tucked inside one of her recipe books, not hidden exactly, but not easy to find either. The pages were soft, worn with handling, as if she had reread them many times before sealing them away. There was a note in her handwriting clipped to the top. "To be read aloud when the time is right. Love, Marlene." The letter was addressed to both Peter and me. I held it for a long time before opening it. My hands were shaking, not out of fear, but reverence. I read it twice, the first time through tears, the second in silence. It was raw, loving, and painful. It spoke of her memories, her regrets, her disappointments, and above all, her hope that we, her two men, could find our way back to each other. She wrote, "If you are reading this, it means I'm gone. And if you're reading it out loud, it means you've remembered I had more to say." After reading it, I sat still for nearly an hour. Her words echoed through me, not just because of their emotional weight, but because they were so clearly her rhythms, her voice, her honesty. That night, I decided I would fulfill her wish. I would read the letter to Peter, not as a confrontation, not as an accusation, but as a bridge. A final message from Marlene, untainted by bitterness or resentment. But as the days passed and I tried to approach him, Peter remained distant. He answered my calls with clipped responses, delayed my visits, always busy with something or other. So I waited. I told myself there would be another chance. 2 months later, an opportunity came in the form of an invitation, a family dinner to commemorate what would have been Marlene's 80th birthday. Peter invited a small group, Dana's parents, a few cousins, and us. I took the letter with me, folded carefully in the inner pocket of my blazer, wrapped in the same ribbon Marlene had used to bind it. I hadn't decided whether I would read it or not. I thought maybe the moment would come naturally, that maybe, around the table, someone would say something real, and I would feel the opening. But when I arrived, the house was filled with polite conversation, shallow toasts, and half-hearted smiles. Peter greeted me at the door with a distracted hug. Dana offered me wine. The grandchildren barely made eye contact. Halfway through dinner, Peter made a short speech about his mother, how she had held the family together, how she had been the rock of the household. His tone was flat, rehearsed. I listened, my heart pounding. I looked around the table, saw people nodding, smiling sadly, reaching for another bite of salad. And I knew then, if I didn't speak, no one would. If I didn't read her words, Marlene's voice would be lost beneath the noise of social niceties and forgotten anecdotes. So I stood up, gently, without making a scene. I took the folded letter from my pocket, cleared my throat, and said, "Marlene left something behind. She wanted it read when the time was right. I believe that time is now." That's when Peter's expression changed. He froze, his eyes narrowing. "Dad," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Don't." Not here. I looked at him, confused. "She asked me to—" But he raised his hand. "Stop talking. About Mom," and just like that the air went out of the room. Every fork paused in mid-air. Every conversation ended. A silence fell that was deeper than anything I'd heard since she died. I was left standing there, letter in hand, my son's voice ringing in my ears like an echo I hadn't anticipated. He wasn't just angry, he was afraid. I didn't speak for a long moment after Peter shouted. His words had landed like a slap, not just to silence me, but to assert some invisible boundary he was desperate to preserve. I looked at the letter in my hand, still bound in its faded blue ribbon, and for the first time since I found it, I hesitated. The guests at the table stared at their plates, or at nothing at all. Dana cleared her throat and offered a nervous laugh, trying to diffuse the tension, saying something about how emotions were running high this time of year, but no one responded. Peter kept his gaze fixed on me, arms crossed, jaw clenched tight as if he were daring me to continue. And so I sat down slowly, the letter still in my hand, feeling its weight grow heavier than paper should allow. I hadn't come to make a scene. I had come to honor Marlene's request. But now I realized that in doing so, I had inadvertently stirred something raw and unresolved in my son, something I didn't yet understand. After dessert was served, Peter avoided eye contact with me, retreating to the kitchen under the pretense of helping Dana with the dishes. I remained at the table, my appetite gone, sipping lukewarm coffee and trying to ignore the whispered conversations that had erupted among the guests. Someone asked if I was okay, and I nodded, offering a smile that I knew looked as fake as it felt. I excused myself soon after and left the house without saying goodbye to Peter. The evening air outside was crisp for a Tucson night, and I walked slowly to my car, feeling the dull ache in my knees that always followed long periods of sitting. I sat behind the wheel for several minutes before starting the engine. The house behind me, once filled with memories of Marlene during better times, now felt foreign, like the shell of a life that no longer existed. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in the armchair by the window, watching the blinking red lights on the neighbor's porch across the street, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the old grandfather clock that Marlene had insisted we keep, even when it no longer kept perfect time. I thought about Peter's reaction, his hostility, the sudden spike of emotion, the coldness in his eyes. He hadn't looked at me like a son looks at a father. He had looked at me like a man guarding a vault, afraid of what might spill out if the door opened even a crack. And I kept returning to that moment at the table, the way his voice had trembled, not just with anger, but with something closer to panic. I rose at dawn, made a pot of coffee, and sat down with the letter again. I read it slowly this time, word by word, allowing each phrase to settle in the space between the walls. Marlene had written with a kind of unfiltered honesty I hadn't seen in years. She spoke not only of her love and her memories, but of her fears, the creeping sense of invisibility she had felt in her final years, the disappointment she carried toward Peter, the way she tried to forgive both him and herself for drifting apart. She wrote that she knew he was struggling with things he didn't speak of, that she had overheard fragments of his conversations when he thought she was asleep. She had heard him tell Dana once, in a voice filled with frustration, "Sometimes I think it would be easier if she were already gone." That sentence landed on me like a fist to the chest, not because I believed it. Peter was many things. But cruel wasn't one of them. But because Marlene had heard it and remembered it, and yet she didn't write with bitterness. She wrote with sorrow, with longing, with forgiveness. She ended the letter with a plea. "Please don't let silence define the rest of your lives. Speak to each other, not about me, but about you. I want to believe that after I'm gone, there will still be a family left between you two." I folded the letter again, my hands trembling, and placed it back in the drawer where I now kept it. No longer hidden among cookbooks, but still waiting. I couldn't ignore what had been exposed. Marlene had trusted me with her final words, and in trying to deliver them, I had uncovered a depth of pain in my son that I had never anticipated. There was more to his anger than just grief. Something unspoken lived there. Guilt, perhaps, or shame. And suddenly, the memory of those final weeks with Marlene began to shift in my mind, revealing cracks I hadn't wanted to examine too closely. I remembered now how Peter had seemed particularly distant during that time, how he had avoided being alone in the same room with her, always sending Dana or one of the grandchildren in his place. I remembered the evening when Marlene asked if Peter had ever confided in me about something. She didn't say what, but at the time I had shrugged it off, thinking she was just being overly sensitive, too consumed by her own sadness to see clearly. But what if she had seen clearly? What if she had heard more than just one sentence whispered in frustration? I began to dig, not out of spite, but out of a quiet, growing need to understand. I started with photographs. I opened the old albums that Marlene kept in the linen closet. 3 large leather-bound books filled with our life together. There were dozens of pictures of Peter as a boy, then as a teenager, and later as a young father. Marlene had written dates and captions beneath nearly every photo, her tidy cursive still vivid in blue ink. I flipped through pages of smiling faces, birthday cakes, camping trips, holidays. Then I reached the last few pages, where the photos stopped altogether. The final entry was a photo from Peter's 50th birthday, 4 years ago. Nothing after that. Just empty plastic sleeves and one blank piece of notebook paper tucked in the back. On it, in faint pencil, Marlene had written, "He doesn't let me take pictures anymore. Says it's too much." I sat there, the paper in my hand, the silence in the room thick with meaning. That weekend I tried calling Peter again. He didn't answer. I left a message, brief, polite, unaccusatory. I told him I had been thinking about him, that I'd like to talk, that there were things I didn't understand, and I was ready to listen. No response. I waited 3 days and called again. Still nothing. I tried Dana's number. She picked up, and I could hear the tension in her voice even before I spoke. "Hi, Gerald," she said quickly. "Peter's not really up for talking right now. He's been under a lot of stress. Work's been crazy. Maybe give it a little time." I thanked her, said I understood, and hung up, knowing that I had been dismissed with grace, but dismissed nonetheless. The following week I received a letter in the mail. It was from Peter. A single page, typed, folded crisply into thirds. The language was clinical, polite, distant. He wrote that he didn't appreciate being blindsided in front of family, that the letter I attempted to read wasn't appropriate for a social gathering. That grief was private and complicated, and he didn't need my help processing his feelings about Mom. He wrote, "I know you mean well, but you're making things harder." And finally, at the bottom, in a line that struck deeper than any insult could have, "Please don't bring this up again." I read his letter 3 times, the first time with disbelief, the second with rising anger, and the third with a sense of terrible, resigned clarity. Peter wasn't just rejecting my attempt to share Marlene's words, he was rejecting Marlene's voice itself. Or perhaps he was afraid of it, afraid of what it might confirm, afraid of what it might accuse him of, even if it never meant to. And yet I couldn't bring myself to be angry with him, because beneath all of it I recognized the signs. This wasn't just grief, it was shame, and shame corrodes silently, like rust beneath the paint, weakening everything until it collapses under its own weight. I sat in my armchair that night, holding both letters, his and hers, one cold and brittle, the other warm and trembling with memory. And I realized something important. Marlene hadn't written that letter just for me to deliver a message. She had written it because she knew I would eventually be alone with our son's silence. She knew that I would need something to keep me standing when he tried to push me away. And perhaps most of all, she had written it to preserve a truth that might otherwise be erased. That night, I made a decision. I would not hide her letter again. I would not pretend it hadn't been written. I would find a way to let it be heard, not as a weapon, not as a sermon, but as a final gift. I didn't know how yet or when, but I knew this. The time would come, and when it did, I would be ready. 3 weeks passed before I saw Peter again. I didn't expect to, and I hadn't made another attempt to reach out. I had decided to wait for the right moment, but I had also begun to wonder whether that moment would ever come. In the meantime, I went about my routine. Slow mornings, quiet afternoons, evenings spent sitting by the window with a cup of tea, and the same thoughts circling like birds that refused to land. The letter from Marlene remained in my desk drawer, occasionally reread in full, but mostly just held. I had no intention of forcing it on anyone, least of all on Peter, but I also hadn't given up on her wish. I still believed that her voice deserved to be heard, no matter how uncomfortable it might be for others. I simply didn't know when or how that might happen. Then the invitation came. Dana called one Friday morning, her voice unusually upbeat, telling me they were planning a small Sunday lunch, a family reset. She called it, just the four of us. Peter, Dana, myself, and their daughter Emily, who had recently returned from college. She said Peter wanted to clear the air. I didn't know whether to believe that or not, but I agreed without hesitation. I hadn't seen Emily in nearly 2 years, and the thought of seeing her again, even briefly, filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in months. I shaved that morning, pressed a clean shirt, and even picked up a small box of lemon cookies from the bakery Marlene used to love. I arrived at their house 15 minutes early and sat in the car until it was exactly noon. I didn't want to appear too eager, though every cell in my body longed for some kind of reconciliation, some restoration of what had once been the ordinary rhythm of family. Peter greeted me at the door with a strained smile and a brief nod, nothing more. Dana was warmer, ushering me in with a hug and a cheerful mention of how good it was to see me. Emily appeared from the hallway, thinner than I remembered, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes tired but kind. She hugged me tightly and said, "Hi, Grandpa." And in that moment I felt a crack in the wall I hadn't realized had hardened between us. We sat down at the dining table, which had been set with a simplicity that reminded me of quieter times. No centerpiece, no candles, just plates, glasses, and a bowl of salad in the center. The main dish was a baked chicken recipe Marlene used to make, and I wondered for a moment whether Dana had chosen it intentionally or if it had just been coincidence. Either way, it stirred something in me I hadn't expected, a soft grief, uninvited but not unwelcome. The meal began quietly, conversation cautious and surface level. Emily spoke about her classes, Dana chimed in with stories about their new neighbors, and Peter remained mostly silent, answering questions with nods or single-sentence replies. I contributed where I could, careful not to step too far into any emotional territory, but beneath it all, I could feel the tension coiled like a spring in the middle of the table. It was in the pauses between topics, in Peter's eyes darting toward me and then away, in Dana's gentle attempts to smooth the silence. At one point I asked Emily if she remembered the camping trip we all took to the White Mountains when she was 10. She smiled and nodded, saying she still had the photo of her sitting on my shoulders while Peter tried to cook hot dogs over the fire. "Mom says you were the only one who didn't get food poisoning that weekend," she added with a laugh, and for a moment we all chuckled. Even Peter smiled. It felt like a moment of thawing. That's when I made a mistake. It wasn't planned. I hadn't come with any agenda, and I hadn't brought the letter. But in that fragile space of semi-warmth, I let my guard down. I said, "Your mother would have loved this. She always said Sundays were her favorite, because it meant family and comfort food. The words weren't accusatory or loaded, just a quiet observation spoken aloud. But Peter's expression shifted instantly. His face hardened, the smile vanished, and he set down his fork with a soft clink. The mood at the table changed in an instant. Dana looked at Peter, her eyes warning, pleading, but he ignored her. "Dad," he said, voice flat but firm. "I thought we talked about this." I turned to him, confused. "Talked about what?" He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You're doing it again." Making everything about Mom. Every visit, every conversation, it circles back to her like some kind of guilt trip. I blinked, genuinely taken aback. "She was my wife, Peter. Of course I talk about her." He shook his head. "You talk about her like you're trying to make me feel something I'm not ready to feel. Like you're waiting for me to break down and apologize for being a bad son." His voice rose slightly, not loud, but sharp. Maybe I was. I don't know. "But this thing you keep doing, it's not helping. It's manipulative." I looked at him, stunned. Dana reached for his arm, whispering his name, but he pulled away. Emily sat frozen, her eyes wide and uncertain. "I'm not trying to manipulate anyone," I said quietly. "I just miss her." Peter's mouth twisted into a bitter smile. "Yeah, well, we all miss her. But some of us are trying to move on without turning every conversation into a funeral eulogy." I opened my mouth to respond, but he wasn't finished. "You know what really pisses me off?" He continued. "You act like you're the only one who lost her, like your grief is more important than mine, like you're entitled to judge how I feel because I didn't show up the way you think I should have. But you don't know what was going on with me. You never asked. You just decided I failed you. And now you want me to sit here and nod along while you bring her up like some sacred relic I'm supposed to worship." I felt my chest tighten. My hands trembled slightly in my lap. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not a man filled with anger, but a man drowning in something heavier. I said, "I'm sorry you felt judged. That was never my intent." Peter scoffed and looked away, shaking his head. The rest of the meal passed in tense silence. Emily tried to restart the conversation, but it fizzled almost immediately. Dana cleared the plates and offered dessert, which everyone declined. I stood to leave soon after, thanking Dana and Emily quietly, then turning to Peter and saying, "My door is always open." He didn't respond, just stared out the window, jaw clenched, hands in fists on the table. Back home, I paced the kitchen for over an hour, trying to understand what had just happened. I kept replaying his words, his expression, the cold fury behind them. It wasn't just about Marlene, it wasn't even about the letter. Something inside Peter was fractured, and whatever lived there was old, deep, and festering. I went to the drawer, pulled out Marlene's letter, and sat with it again. I imagined reading it aloud that afternoon, and how much worse things might have gone. But I also felt something shift in me. Peter's reaction wasn't rejection, it was defense. He was defending himself against something he couldn't face. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But what hurt most wasn't his anger. It was the realization that he didn't see me as someone to turn to anymore. Not as a father, not as a companion in grief. Just another reminder of everything he wanted to forget. That night, I dreamed of Marlene. She stood in the garden behind our old house in Flagstaff, where the lilac bushes had once grown taller than our heads. She was wearing the green dress she wore on our anniversary the year Peter graduated from high school. In the dream, she turned to me and said, You'll have to tell the truth. Even if it breaks something, even if he hates you for it. I woke up with tears on my face and the sheets twisted around my legs like restraints. I got up, washed my face, and made coffee, though it was still dark outside. I knew then that the time was coming. I didn't know when, but it would come, and when it did, I would be ready, even if it meant losing my son for good. Because some truths, once written, demand to be heard. The next few weeks passed in a strange twilight of avoidance. I neither reached out to Peter nor heard anything from him. The phone remained silent, and the mailbox held only utility bills and grocery store flyers. I went about my days as if life had simply narrowed itself into routine, measured steps, solitary meals, the same radio station humming in the background, the sound of birds outside my window in the early morning light. But beneath that quiet domestic rhythm, something churned. I could feel it pressing in, a kind of emotional gravity pulling me inward. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was a question that had rooted itself deep in the soil of my consciousness and refused to be ignored. What if Peter wasn't simply hurt or ashamed, but hiding something? What if Marlene had sensed it too? Her letter had hinted at a secret, a tension, a withdrawal, a sadness she hadn't fully named. She had written, "Peter was always good at disappearing without moving. I could be sitting beside him and still feel like I'd lost him." That line haunted me, not because I didn't understand it, but because I did. I had felt that too, especially in the last year of her life. He had come less frequently, spoke in shorter sentences, and even when he was present, there was a stiffness to his posture, a distracted edge to his voice, as though he was afraid to stop and actually feel something. At the time, I chalked it up to stress, work, the burdens of adulthood. But now I began to wonder if it had been something deeper. One rainy afternoon, I went into the garage to look for an old set of woodworking tools. I had decided to repair a broken kitchen cabinet hinge that had annoyed me for months. In the corner of the garage, beneath an old canvas tarp, sat a dusty box labelled in Marlene's handwriting. Peter. High school. College. It was strange, really, how I had never noticed it there before. I pulled it out, the cardboard soft at the edges from age and moisture. Inside were yearbooks, report cards, printed essays, photos of Peter with his debate team, and several notebooks, some with college class notes, others more personal. I know I shouldn't have read them. There's something sacred about a young man's journals. But I felt compelled, not out of nosiness, but out of a desperate need to understand who my son had once been, and how he had come to be the man who now couldn't stand to be in the same room with his father's grief. One entry, written in small, slanted handwriting, stood out. It was dated March 1992. Peter would have been 22 then, a senior in college. It read, "I don't know how to tell them. I don't know if I ever will. Sometimes I think Dad would be fine, maybe even try to understand. But Mom, she'd see it as a failure, something she did wrong. I can't bear that. So I keep my mouth shut and smile. And every time she tells me how proud she is, it makes me want to vanish." There was no explanation, no elaboration. Just that. I sat in the garage for nearly an hour, rereading that passage. I didn't know exactly what Peter had meant, but I knew what it felt like to carry a silence for so long it starts to change the shape of your soul. I returned the notebook to the box, closed it, and placed it back where I found it. Whatever Peter had buried, he had buried for a reason, and it wasn't mine to exhume. But it made me understand something vital. His anger wasn't about the letter. It was about being seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. And he hated it. The turning point came on a Saturday in late October, just as the desert light had begun to shift toward winter's gentler angle. Emily called and asked if she could stop by for a visit. She arrived that afternoon with 2 coffees and a bag of almond croissants, saying she needed a break from her mother's constant questions about graduate school. We sat in the sunroom, and for the first time in months I laughed. She told me about her classes, a boy she was seeing, and a professor who insisted on using overhead projectors in the year 2025. Eventually the conversation drifted to Peter, and I saw her expression shift, softening into something uncertain. She said, "He's been distant even with me. He doesn't talk much about Grandma. I think he's scared I asked her what he was scared of, and she paused before answering. Of what he did. Or didn't do. I think he feels like he failed her. And you?" I looked at her for a long time before saying, "He didn't fail her. He just disappeared too soon." She nodded and asked quietly, "Can I read the letter?" I was surprised, not because she wanted to read it, but because she asked so gently. I went to the desk, pulled it out, and handed it to her. She read it slowly, her lips moving as she traced each line, her hands trembling just slightly. When she finished, she folded it carefully and handed it back. "She loved him so much," she said. "Even in the end." She wasn't angry, just sad, I nodded. Emily looked at me and added, "You should read it to him. Even if he yells, even if he walks out, someone has to say it out loud." That night, I made my decision. I would read the letter, not privately, not quietly, but in front of the people who mattered. Not to shame Peter, but to honor Marlene. Not to resolve old grievances, but to release them. Because silence had held this family hostage for too long. It was time for truth. Not the comfortable version we tell ourselves over holiday dinners, but the kind that shakes something loose in your ribs and forces you to breathe differently. The day I chose to read Marlene's letter was a Sunday, much like the ones she used to orchestrate with a kind of sacred routine. Early grocery runs, the smell of pot roast or lemon chicken drifting through the house, a table set not with elegance, but with warmth. I invited Peter, Dana, and Emily to my home under the pretext of a quiet meal. Just the 4 of us. No expectations. I said I wanted to share a few memories. Maybe look through some old photo albums together. A way to remember her, not with mourning, but with gratitude. Peter hesitated before agreeing. His voice clipped, but he said yes. And that alone felt like a crack in the door I had long thought sealed shut. I spent the morning preparing, choosing Marlene's favorite dishes, arranging photographs on the sideboard, pulling out a few records she used to play on lazy afternoons. I laid the letter on the table beside my chair, not hidden, not dramatic, simply present, as if it belonged there, as if she was still part of the room. They arrived just after 1. Emily greeted me with a quiet hug, her eyes already scanning the space, no doubt looking for signs of tension. Dana smiled in that measured way she had perfected over the years, polite but distant. Peter entered last, stiff-backed, holding a bottle of wine he didn't offer, simply placed it on the counter without comment. We sat at the table and ate in relative peace, the conversation mild, safe, confined to the mundane, work, traffic, the weather's slow shift into cooler nights. I waited until the plates had been cleared, the coffee poured, and the edge of the afternoon had softened. I reached for the letter without fanfare, my fingers steady but cold. I said, "Before we move on, there's something Marlene asked me to share. She wrote this not long before she passed. She wanted us to hear it together." Peter looked up sharply, his jaw tightening, the muscle twitching near his temple. Dinah froze, her cup halfway to her lips. Emily, sitting beside me, simply nodded. I unfolded the letter and began to read. Her words filled the room slowly, gently at first, as if they were air returning to lungs that had forgotten how to expand. She wrote about memories, of our first home, of Peter's birth, of the nights she would sit by his crib and sing even when he was too old to need lullabies. She wrote about her pride in him, about the man he had become, the sacrifices he had made for his own family. And then the letter turned, quietly but unmistakably, to sorrow. She wrote, "There were times in my final years when I felt like a shadow in my own house. I don't say this to hurt you, Peter, only to be honest. I missed you terribly, even when you were in the same room. I missed the boy who used to run through the hallway shouting questions about dinosaurs, who once cried when he saw me crying. Somewhere along the way we stopped seeing each other. I never stopped loving you, but I ached for something real, a moment of connection I didn't have to beg for." As I read those words, I didn't look up. I couldn't. I could feel the room tightening around me, the silence stretching into something unbearable. She continued, "I know you were carrying something I didn't understand. I heard you that night in the kitchen when you thought I was asleep. You said it would be easier if I were gone. I want you to know, I forgave you the moment I heard it. I knew it came from pain, not cruelty, but I needed you to know that I heard it. I saw you even when you were trying to disappear." At that line, I heard Peter exhale sharply, almost a gasp, and then the scrape of a chair. I looked up just as he stood, fists clenched at his sides, his face flushed. "Stop," he said, his voice trembling. "Just stop." I didn't stop. I had to finish. Her letter was almost done. She wrote, "I don't want my last words to be silence. I want them to be truth, and my truth is this. I love you. I always have. I hope that someday, when the weight lifts, you'll let yourself love openly again. Let yourself be seen." I folded the paper and laid it on the table. The room was still. Peter stood motionless, his breathing shallow, as if the air had been knocked from him. Dana's eyes were glassy, and Emily sat with her hand on mine. Then Peter spoke. Not loudly, but with a rawness I hadn't heard since he was a child. "You had no right." I looked at him. "It was her wish." He shook his head. "No, you used it. You used her words to make me feel guilty, to humiliate me. That's not true," I said. "I read it because she asked me to. I read it because she loved you, and you deserved to hear it." He laughed bitterly. "Deserved? You think I deserve this? To be exposed like that? To have my daughter hear that I said I wanted my own mother dead?" "She knew you didn't mean it," I said. "She forgave you. She wanted to help you heal. She wanted you to control me." He snapped. "And you loved it. You've been waiting for this, to finally be the good one, the grieving widower, the martyr Peter," Dana said, warning in her voice. But he ignored her. "You think I don't remember the years you barely spoke to her? When you'd go days without saying more than a grunt while reading your damn newspaper? You weren't some saint, Dad. You shut down. You left her alone in that house long before she died. But now you want to stand there and pretend like you were her savior." His words hit me like blows. Not because they were entirely false, but because I had thought them myself, in darker moments, when guilt crept in uninvited. I said quietly, "I failed her too. I know that. That's why I kept the letter. That's why I waited so long to read it. Because I knew it would hurt, but I also knew it might help." He sat back down slowly, like his legs had given out. His hands trembled. He didn't speak for a long time. Emily broke the silence. "Dad," she said, her voice gentle but unwavering. "I'm glad he read it. I needed to hear it. I didn't know how much she missed us. I didn't know how much we all drifted away." Peter didn't look at her. He stared at the table, then at me, and finally, quietly asked, "Do you have a copy?" I nodded. It's yours if you want it. He reached out, took the folded pages, and held them for a moment before slipping them into his jacket pocket. No one said anything after that. Dana began clearing the table. Emily helped. Peter sat still. I stood and walked to the sink, suddenly exhausted, as if I had run a great distance without moving. They left not long after. Peter didn't hug me, didn't even say goodbye. But he took the letter with him. And that, I told myself, was something. A seed, at least, planted in the wreckage of all that had been unspoken for too long. The days that followed were heavy with silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt like peace or resolution, but rather the silence that lingers after a storm has passed, when the air is thick with unspoken words and the weight of what was left unsaid. I didn't hear from Peter for several days after the dinner, and I didn't reach out to him either. It was as though we had both retreated into separate spaces, each of us holding on to the fragments of the conversation we had shared, trying to make sense of it in our own way. I went about my days as I had before, early mornings spent with a cup of coffee and the radio playing softly in the background, afternoons filled with the quiet routine of household chores, evenings alone with my thoughts. But even in the silence, I knew something was shifting. I had read the letter, as Marlene had asked, and I had done so with all the intention of fulfilling her final wish. But in doing so, I had unleashed something in Peter, something deep and painful, something that had been buried for far too long. And in that moment, I realized that reading the letter had only been the beginning. It wasn't enough just to hear the words. They had to be understood, they had to be processed, they had to be shared, not as a weapon, not as a confession, but as a bridge to something deeper. That evening, just as the sky was fading into twilight, the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but something in the pit of my stomach told me it was him. I picked up the receiver and said, "Hello?" There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a hesitant voice. "Dad?" It was Peter. His voice sounded different, softer, quieter than usual. He wasn't angry. He wasn't yelling. And for the first time in a long time, I could hear the fatigue in his voice. I felt a strange twist in my chest, an unfamiliar combination of relief and dread. "Peter," I said, trying to steady my voice. "What is it? Are you all right?" There was another long pause before he answered, his words almost swallowed by the silence. I don't know how to say this, but I'm sorry. I should have said it sooner, and I know it doesn't change anything, but I'm sorry, Dad. I've been holding on to too much, and I don't know how to let it go." His apology, though long overdue, came as a shock. I had expected anger, perhaps a demand for answers, or even silence, but not this, not the vulnerability in his voice, the rawness that bled through every word. I was quiet for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Part of me wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but the other part of me was still wary, still uncertain of where this conversation would lead. After all, this was the son who had closed himself off from me, who had distanced himself from Marlene in her final years. I wasn't sure if I could trust the apology, or if it was just another fleeting moment of guilt. "Peter," I said finally, my voice steady but filled with the weight of years. "It's been a long time coming, but I appreciate it. I appreciate that you're saying this now." I paused, searching for the right words. "But I need you to understand something. It's not about blaming you. It's about finding a way back, to each other. I've been holding on to my own mistakes too, Peter, and maybe that's part of the problem. But we can't fix it if we don't start somewhere. We can't pretend that it's all gone, or that it never happened. We can't just move on without acknowledging what's been broken." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and I felt my heart pounding in my chest. Was he listening? Was he really hearing me? After what felt like an eternity, he spoke again, his voice quiet, but filled with a strange kind of acceptance. "I know, Dad. I know, I'm scared. I'm scared of facing it all, of facing you, of facing myself. I don't know how to be the son you want me to be." His words cut through me, raw and unguarded. He wasn't just apologizing for the past. He was apologizing for himself, for the man he had become, for the walls he had built between us. And in that moment, I understood. He wasn't just afraid of me. He was afraid of what acknowledging the truth might mean for his own life, for his own identity. "Peter," I said, my voice softer now, "I don't need you to be perfect. I don't need you to be anything other than yourself. But I need you to let me in, let me help, let me be your father again. Not just when it's convenient, not just when you feel like it's safe, but all the time, even when it's hard." There was another long pause, and I could almost hear the struggle in his breath. Finally, he spoke again, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't know if I can do that, Dad. I don't know if I can let go of all the shit I've been holding on to." "You don't have to let it all go at once," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm and steady. "But you have to start somewhere, and it starts with this. It starts with us." Talking, I could feel the shift in the air, as if something between us had finally cracked open, something long buried beneath layers of pride and fear. It wasn't easy. It wasn't a quick fix, but it was something real, something I hadn't felt from him in years. And it was enough. "I'll try," he said finally, his voice smaller now, almost resigned. "I'll try, Dad. I don't know if I can be who you want me to be, but I'll try. That's all I'm asking for," I said. And with that, the conversation ended. The line went quiet, and I sat there in the stillness of my living room, the phone pressed to my ear, feeling the weight of the words that had just passed between us. There was no grand resolution, no magical moment where everything was suddenly perfect. But there was something more important than that. There was the beginning of healing, the beginning of understanding. And in that moment, I realized that I had been waiting for this moment. Not for Peter to come to some grand epiphany, but for him to finally acknowledge the truth, to see me, to see us, not as some idealized version of family, but as human beings, flawed, broken, but still trying to find a way back to each other. That night, I went to bed with a strange sense of peace. It wasn't the peace that comes with a clear resolution, but the kind that comes with knowing that something important had shifted. The kind of peace that comes with the realization that, despite everything, despite the years of silence and hurt, there was still hope. The next morning, I awoke early, as I always did. But today there was a lightness to the air, a sense of anticipation. I made my coffee and sat by the window, watching as the sky began to brighten with the first light of day. The world outside seemed to be waking up too, stretching and yawning, just like me. I didn't know what the future held for Peter and me, or for the rest of our family. But I knew one thing for certain. We had taken the first step. And that, I thought as I sipped my coffee, was enough. A few weeks passed after that conversation with Peter, and I found myself living in a kind of quiet anticipation. It wasn't the kind of waiting that gnaws at your insides, the kind that comes from dread or uncertainty. No, this was a different kind of waiting, one filled with a strange kind of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, we were finally beginning to heal. Peter had been calling more frequently, not always with grand announcements or confessions, but with small exchanges that reminded me of the man he had been before all the distance. At first they were awkward. Short phone calls, a question about how I was feeling, or a mention of something that had happened at work. But they were real. They were attempts at connection, at bridging the gap that had existed between us for so long. One afternoon, just a few days after the call where he had apologized, Peter came to the house, unannounced. I was in the garden, trimming the rose bushes that had grown wild over the past few months. I heard his footsteps on the gravel path behind me and turned to see him standing there, looking uncertain but determined, as if he had been rehearsing this moment in his head for days. He held out his hand, a hesitant gesture, as though waiting for me to either pull him in or push him away. I stepped forward, taking his hand firmly in mine. "You came," I said simply. He nodded, his expression softening. "I know I've been avoiding this. Avoiding you. And I'm sorry for that." I gestured toward the bench beneath the old oak tree, the one where Marlene had spent countless afternoons reading or knitting, the one that still carried the imprint of her presence, even though she was no longer there. "Sit with me," I said. "We can talk." For a long while, we just sat in silence, the kind of silence that no longer felt oppressive but comfortable, like the quiet before the storm, when you can feel the tension breaking without knowing how. Finally, Peter spoke. His voice steady but filled with a vulnerability I hadn't heard from him in years. "Dad, I've been thinking a lot about everything. About Mom, about what happened between us. I don't know if I can ever make up for the way I pulled away from her, from you, but I need you to know that I'm trying. I want to try." I felt a lump form in my throat. The words were simple, but they were everything. They were the admission I had been waiting for, the acknowledgement of the distance, the regret for the years lost. "Peter," I said softly, "you don't have to make up for anything. You just need to be here, that's all." "For both of us," he nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. It was the first time in a long time that I had seen him smile without restraint, without the bitterness that had often clouded his expression. "I've been holding on to so much, Dad," he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "It's like I built this wall around myself, and I didn't even realize how thick it had gotten until now." "Walls are easy to build," I said quietly, "but they're harder to tear down." He sighed, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of everything he had been carrying was finally beginning to lift. "I know, and I'm sorry it took me so long to realize that." We sat there for a while longer, just talking about small things, things we hadn't talked about in years. The weather, the news, family gossip, nothing heavy, nothing profound, but it felt like a beginning. For the first time in ages, it felt like we were talking as father and son, as people who shared more than just blood. We were sharing memories again. Peter told me about a fishing trip he had taken with his friends, about his work, about Emily's recent graduation. I listened, genuinely interested, and he listened to me as well. It was as if we were both learning how to be a part of each other's lives again. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, Peter stood up and stretched. "I should probably go," he said, his voice more relaxed than when he had arrived. "But I'll come back. We'll do this again, Dad, I promise." "I'd like that," I said. He smiled, and for the first time, I saw the weight of the years fall away from him, if only for a moment. He didn't leave immediately, though. He stood there for a moment longer, watching me as I gathered the clippers and put them away. Then, in a voice just barely above a whisper, he said, I think I'll bring Emily next time. She's been asking about you. She misses you." My heart swelled at that. Emily, the last of the grandchildren I hadn't seen enough of in recent years. I had missed so much of her life, just as I had missed so much of Peter's. But it wasn't too late. It was never too late. "I'd love to see her," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Bring her whenever you're ready." Peter nodded and walked towards the gate, pausing just once to turn back to me. "I'll bring her soon," he said. "Take care, Dad." I watched him walk away, a part of me still unsure, still carrying the weight of everything that had come before, but another part, perhaps a stronger part, feeling a flicker of hope. For the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, we could rebuild what had been broken. Later that evening, I sat at the kitchen table, the quiet of the house settling around me like an old friend. I could hear the distant hum of the refrigerator, the rustling of leaves outside and the growing evening wind. It was strange, this feeling of peace mixed with something more, a sense that something was shifting, something had been set in motion that couldn't be undone. It wasn't perfect. There were no guarantees, no promises that everything would work out the way we all hoped. But there was a chance. There was a chance for us to rebuild, for Peter to finally heal, and for me to let go of the ghosts of the past. I looked over at the empty chair at the table, the chair that Marlene used to sit in, the one that still seemed to carry the imprint of her presence. And I smiled softly to myself. She would have been proud of Peter for taking that first step, for reaching out when he had been so reluctant before. Proud of both of us for finally finding a way back to each other. The doorbell rang, pulling me out of my thoughts. I stood up and walked to the door, expecting maybe a neighbor or a late delivery. But when I opened it, there stood Peter, his hand raised in a half-wave, a sheepish grin on his face. "I forgot," he said. "I promised I'd bring Emily. She's out in the car, just getting her coat. Can we come in?" I smiled, the knot that had been lodged in my chest for so long loosening, and stepped aside. "Of course, I'm glad you're both here." And as I ushered them inside, I realized something important. Marlene had been right. We hadn't lost everything. We had just been lost. But now we were starting to find our way back, together.